let's get into it, for God's sakes. Let's bring on Margaret Sullivan, media columnist, Washington Post. Margaret Sullivan, join us, please.
Thank you. Hi, John.
Author of Ghosting the News, Local Journalism, The Crisis of American Democracy. The episode that we did was about how there's sort of two categories of media now. There's sort of what's considered the mainstream media, liberal, corporate-owned, and then there's the right-wing media, generally also corporate-owned. And the right-wing media feels like it has a much more of a political bent. It's much more activist in its, or involved in its political goals. There's a lot more synergy between, they seem like the political arm of a political party, the media arm of a political party.
Yeah.
Left-wing media doesn't have the same efficacy. Would you say that's a fair determination of where we're at? And that's not to include like really liberal media, which is like Democracy Now!, which is much more of like muckraking, and I think much more interesting and effective.
I think you're right that right-wing media is its own thing and is very effective and is agenda-driven. And then I don't know, though, that I would describe the rest of everything else as the left-leaning media, because very often it's kind of trying to be down the middle in a way that's not very useful. It's trying to find this, this kind of inoffensive middle ground. And sometimes that means giving equal weight to two unequal things. And that's not so good. So when I hear it described as, sort of the left-wing media, which is actually what people like Sean Hannity would like everybody to believe, I don't really buy that.
Well, that's what I'm saying. That's the establishment view is there's a mainstream liberal media and then there's a right-wing media. I tend to agree with you that it's not liberal, that Democracy Now! Or some parts of NPR is more steeped in kind of a liberal aesthetic more than it is activist. But that the general media that we have now, corporate and mainstream, is biased towards sensationalism and towards, in some ways, shallow narrative.
So when you ask people, what do you think of the media? That is a very broad question, right? Mm-hmm. But what most people think is they think about cable news.
Yes.
It's kind of been studied. So when you're asking people about the media, they're thinking like CNN. That's often what they're thinking.
Right.
And so, I would totally agree with you that what happens on cable news, because they got to fill 24 hours, they get tired of the same old thing. They're very oriented towards, change, which is understandable. They're very oriented towards conflict and drama. And they're kind of, you come to it in, varying degrees to get your outrage on. That's what you're doing when you turn on cable news. And I mean, that is especially true of Fox News in the evening, in the primetime shows. You are there to get outraged, and they will help you do that. So,
but they also are more purposeful. I feel like when you turn on Fox News, you really feel the political strategy meeting that occurred behind the scenes, and you really feel their conversation with the head of the Republican National Committee, where they talk about how are we going to propagandize this.
Yeah, I mean, especially during the Trump administration, when there was a complete revolving door between the right-wing media and the Trump White House and the Trump press office and all of that. It was like, Bill Shine went from one to the other, Kayleigh McEnany, all these people, kind of, now I'm on Fox. So now I'm actually in the press office, but now I'm going back to Fox. It was all kind of, it's very symbiotic, and it's kind of all the same crowd. I think, once Trump was out of office, he lost the election. Did you hear that?
No, I thought he was still president.
Yeah,
or
I know.
am I? But that's,
it depends who you ask.
I'm only on Truth Social. It's the only media that I consume. So I'm assuming, that's right.
So, once Trump was not in office, it's sort of like, I think Fox was like, well, oh my gosh, what are we supposed to do? We no longer are the PR arm here. So I think then they just turned to sort of trashing Biden, AOC, go back to Hillary. That was
in some ways they got primaried from the right. I mean, in the election, OAN and Newsmax really went straight right wing QAnon down the rabbit hole. And Fox had a decision to make.
Yeah, what
And
are we
as
going to
they
do?
got, that's right. We got primaried from the right. And so we can either become that and cut their legs out from under them or give a more responsible view. And I think we know which direction they went.
Right. I wrote a column at the time saying I thought it would be great if actually Fox just beefed up its reporting ranks and, became more of what they say they are, which is Fox News. But, I mean, they do have good reporters there. And actually, they very unfortunately have had some terrible casualties covering the war in Ukraine. But if you tune in at night, which is when most people go to Fox, you're going to get a straight hit of, pretty right-wing stuff.
Do you think that the mainstream media that is not Fox, let's put the right-wing media in a separate category, and that also includes right-wing radio, which, and I don't think people realize how for the last 40 years,
yes,
right-wing radio has been a factory in Bhopal of toxic poison that it just releases into the environment about like Democrats are the enemy, liberals are a cancer, this country must be taken back. Like
it's a constant. I think you're driving around, you're listening to this, and I think it really gets into your bloodstream.
No question. So the question becomes, what is either the antidote to that, which you may not be able to engage it directly, but what does a responsible and effective news organization look like in an era of this kind of this conflictinator, this machine that needs outrage? It's clear that the media now, because it's so ubiquitous, is built for 9/11 or an invasion. In the absence of those stories, it has to generate enough urgency and outrage to justify themselves.
Yeah, I do have some ideas about that. And I would also compare it to the problem with it. The difficulty of it is sort of like, how do you cover climate change effectively? You can say how bad it is. You can show the melting, glaciers, and you can show the polar bears, but it's not a natural cable news story to cover. And so, whereas an invasion is a natural or a plane crash or something like that is a story that it just works better. But I mean, a blast of idealism here, if you can stand it. I think that mainstream media, or what I like to call the reality-based press, as opposed to the extreme right-wing press, should redefine itself as to represent what the press is supposed to do, which is be about democracy, voting rights, voting suppression, gerrymandering, the efforts to put people in state office who are going to deny a real election when it happens. I mean, that is a great ongoing story that's about as core and as foundational as it gets. And,
no question.
I see some coverage of that, and I love it. But I don't think it's, it needs to actually be a mission. I mean, the right-wing media has a mission, and
That's
this this should be the mission of the reality-based press. And I'm talking about big newspapers, and I'm talking about
I almost think that's too
cable.
narrow. I mean, I think that there are ways to bolster democracy that are not just about covering how voting
Somebody's
is under
trying to
threat.
tear it down. Right.
That's right.
Right.
I would almost say, what if the media were focused actually not on the political ramifications, but on governance? It
Yes.
strikes me that the media almost ignores governance
Exactly.
for electoral strategy. So there's
Right.
no focus on muckraking at that level. Is the government delivering on the programs that what is the value of the American budget? Not just how much we're spending. What is the value that we get from it?
That's right. And that's why I'd like to see, we always hear a lot about political reporting. It would be so great if it were redefined as actually government reporting, which is
Right.
what it's supposed to be. So less about the palace intrigue and less about the horse race and more about actually, what's going on. I think that we kind of underestimate the interest and the intelligence of the public when we don't do that, because I actually think there's people do give it, they do care about the democracy,
Absolutely.
and they are worried to the extent that they're, that they are being informed about it and tuned into it. I think there's a great way to sort of represent, yeah, you're right. It's broader than just sort of electoral threats to democracy. It's sort of the whole idea of governance, and, government rather than politics would be a way to define it. And also, like, some people talk about a citizen's agenda. What's the citizen's agenda? What would actually be good for the citizens of the United States? What do they need to
Information
know
Bill
about?
of Rights. Let's get an information Bill of Rights of what you used to see. And this may be too broad a question, and it may be prejudicial on its face.
Okay,
and
I'm ready.
Which is why I'm going to ask it.
Good. I'm ready. At least you prepped me for it.
I always felt during the Trump administration that his narcissism was matched only by the narcissism of the media. And so that they took it personally. That there was an image of themselves. The paper you work at, democracy dies in darkness. And that they are the pillars that are doing the thing that you say they're doing, upholding democracy. They are the immune system. They are filtering the toxins to give us a clear thing, but they're not. They are adding to the noise. They've created a model that almost out of necessity cements divisions rather than views context. They should be a context machine. And the question then is this: is the ego, not to anthropomorphize it, but is the ego what gets in the way of, are they more of the status quo than outside of it attempting to clarify it?
Well, I think it's not that simple. Journalists do want to do a good job. And they did get into this to inform and to, they probably got into it for a very good reason. And then you're in the reality of it, and you know that there's a great demand for audience. There's it's, on the cable side, it's about ratings. On the print or sort of digital side, it's about audience.
Right.
Well, Trump was, he lies a lot, but one thing that he has said that's true is he's described himself as a ratings machine. And that is actually very true. When for whatever reason, when he's on the screen or, on the airwaves, it's kind of hard to look away. So, journalists came to understand that if you had his name in the headline, if you were amplifying something that he said that was outrageous, that was going to get a lot of attention. So I don't think that's great, but I would challenge what you said at the beginning of this little bit of conversation, in that I think that, you know a lot. You're very well informed, obviously. How do you know that stuff? Well, you know it through the mainstream media, largely, I think. I mean, you might criticize the Washington Post or the New York Times, and I do too, but ultimately they are bringing you factual information, and then they have the opinion side of their operations, which are kind of doing a lot of the same thing that you're complaining about.
I would push back on the idea that there is this true separation, and that what I think filters into the coverage is the emotional side of, and let's talk about Mueller, for instance, or let's talk about the Iraq War, big stories of our time. There isn't just, well, there's straight reporting and then there's opinion, and the two never meet. I don't think that's correct.
No,
and I think that the journalists are really vulnerable to being worked by the refs, to access to the kinds of things that seep into. They don't know the difference sometimes between a scoop and when they're being fed something, and the thing that they're being fed having a darker purpose to it to be getting out, that there's a strategy behind the information that they get.
That certainly was true during the run up to the Iraq War, which is one of the truly darkest chapters in media history, certainly of the last 100 years.
Right.
The Mueller story, I think that, people were truly concerned about what was happening with Trump. They could see, that this was a very problematic figure. And people felt like Mueller was a straight shooter. Did it go overboard? Way overboard, way overboard. The cable shows became obsessed with it. Twitter, you remember, I don't know if you would see these people with their little cannons, like boom, something just hit. It was just so embarrassing, because they put all this faith in Mueller time, right? The Mueller report does have a tremendous amount of damning substance in it, but it didn't deliver in the way. And then, of course, it was immediately spun by Bill Barr, now the best-selling author that he is.
But that is something that you have to expect. And I would say that the media has been the architect of their own demise. And they would very much like to blame the audience. This is what rates. This is what sells. And I would suggest that you don't know that because you haven't tried the other. And the second part of it is, in terms of it selling, CNN, Fox, MSNBC to a much lesser extent survive on carriage fees, not just advertising.
Yeah, that's absolutely
right. And they're
right.
Hugely, Fox makes $2 billion a year. CNN probably makes almost $1 billion a year. And so there has to be some measure of public interest. It's why what you need is kind of that sensibility of the public interest with better narrative storytelling, maybe, or maybe a little bit of zazz. But the media was the architect of their own falling ratings, in my mind. What they did with Mueller is they made the substance that you speak of immaterial.
It was another very embarrassing chapter.
But they're proud of it. If you talk to a lot of the mainstream media denizens about the Mueller report, it was one of their finer moments.
The coverage of the report might be one thing, but again, it's like the run up to the Iraq War, the run up to the Mueller report for months and months. And remember, it was like, well, is it going to be this weekend? And, is Trump going to be indicted?
That's
right. It wasn't that weekend. And then it wasn't the next weekend. And Trump never was indicted. And then, he came out and said, whatever, he had been fully exonerated. And everybody was like, this is a case where we needed the coverage to say over and over and over again, no, that actually isn't what the report said. But it wasn't played that way.
But how do you cover it? You can't cover the kind of special counsel. It's something that takes place in private. It's sort of academic. It's a lot of grinding work. You can't cover it like it's The Walking Dead. And I think to a large extent,
covered with speculation, and speculation
purely
is a death knell, you
right.
know? And you know what we're bad at in the media? We're bad at prediction, terrible at prediction, and similarly, and it's related, terrible at speculation. And yet there's so much of it.
But I would say even worse is they're bad at accountability. Because
you mean like afterwards, right?
That's right. Afterwards, they all have a round table and they go, did we fuck this up? And then everybody says, well, it was news. What are we supposed to do? Not cover it? It's news. There's never any soul searching. And it's like a game of musical chairs where even when you're wrong, the music stops, but nobody ever removes a chair. They just keep adding them or switching.
I mean, when you want to talk about the lack of accountability, I think that the coverage of Hillary Clinton's email supposed scandal.
No question.
I remember there was this sort of quadrennial, I guess, gathering at Harvard after the campaign. And there was some discussion there about it. And that was like sort of one occasion. But there was very little, kind of like, yeah, we really sort of blew it. We overplayed that. And I have a theory for why it was overplayed in that way. And my theory is that the leadership of news organizations, like a lot of other people in the country, did not believe, they could not bring themselves to believe that Trump could get elected. And so therefore, Hillary was going to be elected, see? So given the fact that she was a shoo-in in their minds and she was going to be crowned, therefore we have to be very, very, very tough on her because we want to be tough on the person who is going to be president.
Think about that.
That's
Think
my
about
theory.
that, though.
Yeah, that's a terrible.
The thought process behind it is pure strategy that has nothing to do with the content that they were supposedly looking at. If you look at the biggest stories of our pastime, you've mentioned them here so far: Mueller, the Iraq War, climate change. Not one of them ends with this media covered in any kind of glory. Each time you kept coming back to, yeah, that was a debacle. Yeah, that was embarrassing. Yeah, we did a terrible job there. But nothing changes because I would say they're being rewarded for it. The money, the rating, whatever it is, they are rewarded. The currency that they're operating on is not the food and currency that we need. And they're not providing it, but they don't have to. I liken it to the New York Mets.
How so?
Well, I need them to win, and they don't, but I stay there for 50 years.
Where's
like
the
an idiot.
accountability there?
Thank you.
Yes.
That's
You're
what
right.
this is about.
Yeah.
But,
okay.
But,
Well, that's
but
good.
what you're saying is not a theory, and Brenda can attest to it. What you said about, I think that's what they were thinking, that is explicitly what they were thinking.
Yeah.
Not only what they were thinking, what they were talking about in the back room.
Right. And then there was soul searching after the 2016 election, but it was very limited. The soul searching went like this. We did not, and it had a very bizarre result.
Mm-hmm.
The soul searching went like this. We did not understand the Trump voter. We need to get out into middle America more. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So there really was some like sort of self-flagellation about that. And so what happened was what I like to call the endless diner series. So then, everybody ran out into middle America and tried to find the Trump voter when he was doing outrageous things and interview them and say, do you guys still like Trump? Because we're talking to you in a diner, and do you still like him? And they'd be like, yeah, we do. And so that was the sort of, we got to make up for the fact that we didn't understand the Trump voter.
Why do you think coverage doesn't focus on understanding the economic realities of how our country is hollowed out economically? Why is it so personality driven? And I don't mean on the broadcaster end, but on the coverage end. Mm-hmm. Why do they not cover systems and outcomes? Why do they cover personalities?
I mean, I'll say two things about that. One is it's hard. It's hard for, cable news to cover that, I would say. I do. And my second thing is I actually do think that places like the Washington Post mm-hmm. and the New York Times do a lot of that kind of coverage. It doesn't get the same attention. Again, we've become so hyper partisan and so polarized that we tend to want our tribal instincts fed at all times. And the media, does cooperate with that. But I think there's been a tremendous amount of really good investigative work and mm-hmm. really good enterprise work and really good, looking at those systems. And then, Trump or Ted Cruz or Josh Hawley say something outrageous. And it's like, yeah, now that's an interesting story.
I do think that there was a sense that the media was embattled, that they were, because they were being attacked, they were going to fight back. And they were going to show him that, it was a personal battle, Trump versus
Jim Acosta.
Yeah, those kinds of bouts. It was a prize fight. And two heavyweights were going to slug it out to see, and the winner would be democracy or fascism. And it strikes me as you're covering the wrong thing.
Right. I mean, I will just note this, that one of the sort of sayings that came out of the Trump administration coverage was my boss mm-hmm. at the time, Marty Barron, a revered editor who has since retired, but he said this off the cuff, but he said, we're not at war, we're at work. His point of view was, we are actually not at war with the Trump administration. That's not what we're about. We're trying to do the work of journalism. And I think that the coverage reflected that. I mean, I heard a lot of good things about the Post coverage during that time. I mean, this was the crazy thing. If you looked at any one of these homepages of the Post, the Times, and a million other places, mm-hmm. wow, it was like almost every headline was Trump. And that was, I think, really bad.
They became incredibly myopic. But I would say that there was an era before Trump. And in that era was a very similar dynamic at play. He may have catalyzed that inferno to a hotter degree, but
Good metaphor.
Thank you. He understood the dynamic and how to play it and how to supercharge it. But that dynamic has been in place.
Well,
that
that's
dynamic of permanent campaign, of the polarities that we'll look at are right and left. And we're incentivizing politicians to become crazier because that's what gets the attention and that's what gets the donations. And couldn't they do a model as tenaciously as they cover this? Because you said earlier, like, it's hard to cover that for cable news. And I think, why? You got nothing but time. You're on 24 hours a day.
I mean, I don't like this, but I think it's probably true, is that it would not rate well. It would be considered kind of boring. Let me go find my outrage somewhere else. I mean, I still think it should happen because I agree with you that the media, the press, if you will, has to be public spirited to some extent. And so, do the right thing. But it's a corporation.
Be outraged, but at the right thing.
Yeah.
And I would disagree with you because when you look at the lack of transparency on Wall Street and the complexity of it that is to the benefit of middlemen and to the negative of retail investors. If you look at a democratic system where the Senate is affirmative action for old white dudes and the power shift in the Senate is socialism for rural states, it's a redistribution of power that allows, there's plenty of outrage that doesn't exist on the right-left polarity. There's plenty of injustice. There's plenty of unfairness. There's plenty of corruption.
That's right. And that's the citizens' agenda. That is looking at things from the point of view of the people you're supposed to be serving by being a journalist. So I agree with you, and I'd like to see more of that. And I think that there's a great opportunity for it too.
Does that come from the corporate ownership or from like Jeff Zucker for everything he wanted? Like Trump was his wet dream.
Yeah, well, he knew it well because he had basically helped invent him at The Apprentice at NBC. When Zucker was at NBC, NBC was in trouble. Zucker looked around and came up with Trump, and that was in the reality TV days. So then he knew very well, once he went over to CNN, that the answer to every prayer was, the ratings machine. But who does it come from? I mean, at cable, at CNN in the Zucker era, that could have come from him. And I actually think they were starting to do some of that stuff. But in a big newspaper, I think it comes from the top of the newsroom, the executive editor, not going against the corporation, but I think it has to be led at the top of newsrooms. And, I'm really happy to see some of that.
We talked to Bob Iger about it. We were talking about some of these kinds of things. And I said, isn't there oxygen for that kind of, with a muckraking spirit, with a sense of tenacity, with a sense of emotion and visceral storytelling, but outside of the paradigm that they've established in this thing? And he said, yeah, I think there is that. I just don't know if it's viable.
And we don't really want to try. We'd rather stick with what's working, what's driving us into the ground. It's happening. One of the issues is that, public trust is in the cellar with the media. And that's a problem.
It's something that's, I think, has been well earned.
Yes.
And should be job one in terms of fighting against doing it. But, what it seems like is people that are invested in polarization and wielding political power and obfuscation and corruption have figured out how to weaponize this game. It reminds me of if you remember, the first televised debate, it was Nixon Kennedy, and Kennedy was like, I'll put on makeup. And Nixon was like, what does that matter? And,
I'm going to sweat. I'm just going to sweat.
So I'll sweat and look crazy. What difference? But when new media comes along, it has the advantage for a second. And then the political power players learn how to weaponize it, how to manipulate it. And right now, I think they're getting their asses kicked. And they haven't figured out how to fight back in the right way.
Right. It calls for a radical change in the
Yes.
way we attract an audience. I would love to think that conversation is taking place. Like, how can we get our audience to respond and to come to us by doing the coverage that's most public spirited? I mean, I have to be fair to my own employer. There is that thinking. There really is. But I don't think it's spread over across the media. I think that there are some really good outlets, and I happen to think that the Washington Post is at the forefront of it. So,
but don't they have, if you go into their newsroom, if you look up on the board, isn't it a click fest for what's getting the most clicks? Aren't they incentivized in the same way?
One of the true issues is that what really gets a lot of attention, a lot of clicks, a lot of audience is opinion. And I know you said you can't draw the line that carefully, but straight opinion, the columnists, they're the ones who tend to have the most engagement.
But what I would say to journalists is actually I think maybe slightly the opposite of what you're saying. I would say to them, have an opinion, because good journalism is opinionated. Good journalism says the way that we are treating workers in this country is an abomination, or the meat and dairy industry have a monopoly. You're seeing something that is an injustice that needs to be corrected, that is a corruption check. And if you don't approach it in that manner, then you're producing something that is agnostic to democracy.
Right.
That is,
you don't have to approach these stories like you're talking about saying, here's what I think. It's that the framing of it, the fact that you went after it, the fact that you put your reporters on it for 3 months or 6 months or whatever it
that's
is,
what I'm
that
saying.
you have this kind of a headline on it. That's the kind of, I mean, I don't really call that opinion, but I understand what you're saying. I think it has to do with context and framing and deciding what you care about.
That's right. It's looking at our system and saying money is corrupting it, and here's how.
Yeah.
And here's my examples, and here's where you're getting screwed in this, and here's what we can do to do it. That's opinion, but it's a bias for non-corruption.
Right. I mean, I think we saw some of that happen after the murder of George Floyd, when a lot of the coverage became very oriented towards civil rights and towards racial injustice. I mean, not everybody liked that coverage, but it was a way that journalism was trying to meet the moment, and I think rightly so.
Do you think the problem is that our media is no longer our collective memory, that it's no longer the context, that they're reacting in real time as opposed to processing the events of the day in a way that can provide us context, perspective, and footholds, as opposed to working backwards, which is what's trending on Twitter, throw that up there?
Yeah, I mean, so much of it is that we've got this fire hose of stuff coming at us on our phones, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not like you're going to go and pick up the newspaper. Not that there's any magic to the fact that it's ink on paper. That's not the point. But, there was a little time to process things and to put things in an order and say, well, this is the most important story here. Now it's so disaggregated, right? It's like opinions coming at you, news is coming at you, outrage is coming at you, and it's not, who knows what it is. And you are also getting a lot of it on social media, where you're already seeing what the algorithm is telling you want to see. And that,
but shouldn't the media contextualize that, not narrate it? Because right now it feels very pointing. Look over here. Look over here. And, it was interesting when the Mueller report came out and it didn't give them the escalation they wanted. It went into the memory hole and it was gone. A story that dominated for 2 years was just gone. The
real sin of that coverage to me was the way the media generally accepted Trump and Bill Barr's framing of what the report said, which was not what the report said. He was not fully exonerated. That did not happen, but that's what the headline said. And once that happened, well, then, and then people were like, oh, that was the Russia hoax. Well, it really wasn't the Russia hoax, because a lot of that stuff was true and in the report, but because of the way it was spun very skillfully, by the way,
but they shouldn't be so easily manipulated. Look, you can't make a product for the craziest amongst us. You have to have, I think we've lost that internal barometer of what's good information and what's bad. And the media's job is to provide it and to earn that integrity again.
One of the really bad things that's happened is in communities, we really don't have as much local news as we used to. Local newspapers are really, really suffering. I mean,
or they've been weaponized by conservative outlets like Sinclair.
Yeah, some of that has happened, but more of what has happened is they've either gone out of business or become sort of specters of what they were. And so you and your neighbor and the people that you run into the grocery store no longer have this sort of common basis of reality that used to come with local news, the local newspaper, actually. So, that's actually a very big problem, and one that I think should get some attention.
Do you see this turning around in any way? Is the opportunity at CNN right now to be a corrective?
I mean, there has to be the will to. There has to be a vision and a will to do it. And I think that needs really strong leadership. And
how would you change it if you could tomorrow, Margaret Sullivan's network, what would that look like? Because clearly the nuclear reactor of information are these 24 hours. They're producing content, 24 hours a day. Then the aggregators come in and they pick out the most outrageous stuff amongst it, or they frame it in the most outrageous way. And that's what gets amplified. What would it look like?
I would have the network be more transparent about what we're going to try to do now. We're actually going to change the way we do things. And here's what we're going to do. And you run ads and you talk to people and you do it at the top of every hour. This is we think the media has failed. And this is what we're going to do differently. And we hope you're going to come, because so much of this does have to do with the public and how they react. And so, give it a try. It's not like the other things work in that great.
Not in a cynical way where you're just branding it. You mean in a real way?
It needs to be branded and talked about, but it not in a cynical. I think it's anything but cynical.
You see it going that way or no?
I mean, not really. I'd like to think that, but
Margaret, you had me. I was right there. You elevated me. I was so ready to follow you. And then you just pulled the rug out.
Well, I mean, isn't the Zucker job open? I don't know. No, it's not. It's been filled. But I don't really think cable news is going to become the leader, the sort of moral leaders of our media. I think that has to come from newspapers and, places like the Texas Tribune, the all digital places that do serve communities. Those places are great.
A grassroots approach that can be a model that can be, force amplified at through smaller towns and outlets.
Absolutely.
And things.
Yeah.
All right. I dig that. That gave me some hope, Margaret. You had me. I was up on a mountain. I was ready to go with you. You pulled it out, but then you gave me a little bit of something at the end.
Okay. I want to do that. I want to leave things on a positive note.
Very, very nice. Margaret Sullivan, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. I really appreciate it. I want to say you are the author of Ghosting the News, Local Journalism and the Crisis of American Democracy, and you are the current media columnist at the Washington Post, which, as you know, is keeping democracy
in the light. Yeah.
That nicely done. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me.
Oh, my pleasure.